Hi, welcome to this video, and I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about the kit that I use when I'm photographing gigs and bands locally, because it's an interesting point. I use Micro Four Thirds for it, and I want to explain why and go through some of the reasons why I use Micro Four Thirds kit for it. When I've got access to APS-C and full frame digital cameras with fast lenses, but I choose still to take my Micro Four Thirds kit out with me, which is against, shall I say, conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom says that the Micro Four Thirds sensor is too small to be used properly or effectively in these kind of situations. You're going to end up with really horrible, muddy, noise-filled images that are not really going to be suitable for the job. And I want to talk a little bit about my own experiences, and you'll see the images that I've photographed at gigs and venues up on screen throughout this video, and it will give you a bit of an idea as to why I think personally the image quality is more than good enough, but we'll come on and talk about that a little bit later on and why it works for me. Now, there is a little bit of a caveat as far as this goes, and that is I am very much talking about what works for me. I don't photograph gigs in large venues. I'm not generally, well, I'm not at all photographing from a crowd or pit barrier area. All of the musicians, artists, bands I photograph tend to be in pubs and clubs local to me. I like documenting the local music scene, and for me Micro Four Thirds works extremely well for that. I'm going to go through that in some of the reasons, but please do take that on board. This is what works for me. It may be of interest to you. If it is, that's great. If it's not, that's not a problem at all. So first of all, what do I actually use? Well, I always take out two bodies and two lenses with me, and that's it. All of the images you're looking at in this video were shot with one of two bodies and two lenses, and they're both prime lenses as well. Now, my main camera body that I use is an Olympus OMD EM1 Mark II. I can't show you that because that's actually what's recording this at the present moment. And the other body is a Panasonic Lumix GX7. Okay, now lens-wise, one of the lenses, you saw it on the Lumix there, and that is a Lumix 20mm f1.7, and the other lens that I take out with me is this, which is an Olympus 45mm f1.8. Now, to give those their full frame focal length equivalents, the 20mm equates to a 40mm, so a little bit wider than a standard 50mm lens, which is I like, and the 90mm gives me, sorry, the 45mm gives me a 90mm equivalent. So that's the kit I use. Now, generally I don't have any issues with the kit. I tend to run it in auto ISO. I adjust the aperture as needed. It's almost always kept very low for fairly obvious reasons, and that's pretty much all I do. The metering in both of them is extremely good from that point of view. I do find the white balance on the Lumix is not as good as the white balance, and that's auto white balance obviously, on the Olympus, so I tend to have to adjust the white balance in images from this a little bit more in post. But aside from that, I can use the same editing profiles and the same workflow for both of them, being perfectly honest. This is a 16 megapixel sensor in the Lumix, and the Olympus is a 20 megapixel sensor, both of which are more than good enough for what I do. So that's the kit that I use. Now, the first reason why I use this, so reason number one, is size and weight. So size-wise, because I'm shooting in pubs, bars and clubs an awful lot, having a APS-C or full frame camera on you with large lenses is, it's very bulky, particularly if you're carrying two bodies, and I like to carry two bodies because that way I'm not having to swap lenses. I have one on a Peak Design strap that I wear, and then I have a Peak Design wrist sling that the other one goes on, and with the wrist sling that allows me to drop it while I use the other body, and it just hangs off of my wrist, so works extremely well in that regard, and it's a setup that works for me. If I was using two DSLRs, as I say, APS-C or full frame, they would be much bigger, they would be much, much heavier from that point of view. Just as an example, so that is 40mm and body. If I just grab my Canon 5D, that's full frame 50mm. So you can see the difference there. It's absolutely colossal. So I find the smaller Micro Four Thirds bodies, and even the EM1 isn't much bigger than this, not significantly anyway. Much easier to move around in a pub or a club with. They get in the way of me and the people who are there to watch the gig, and they're less distracting for the band. So I find it's much, much, much easier to move around. And keep in mind, I've been at some gigs where, I'm wearing this gear for 3-4 hours at a time. So as a result, the weight is a big factor as well. It's a lot easier to lug around two Micro Four Thirds bodies and prime lenses than it is to APS-C or full frame bodies and lenses. The other thing is, it allows me, if I just grab it, this is my, what I call my everyday carry bag. So this is just a leather messenger bag with a camera insert in it. I can carry both of the bodies and lenses with room to spare in that, and it's not obviously a camera bag, it's not obviously obtrusive. I can carry some lens cloths and other bits and pieces in there. It doesn't get in the way. It's a lot easier than carrying around a huge amount of kit in a big bag. It's easier on everybody at the venue, and it's certainly easier on your back. And as I advance in years, that second point I appreciate a lot more. Okay, so that's reason number one. Now, moving on to reason number two is actually the effect Aperture has on Micro Four Thirds cameras. So, if you're not aware, although, for example, this is an f1.7, f1.8 lens on here, and it is that from the point of view of effectively gathering light, so it allows me to shoot in low light extremely well. In terms of depth of field, it's not the same in terms of the narrowness of depth of field on a Micro Four Thirds as it is on a full frame or an APS-C camera. The crop factor comes into play again. So as a result, we're actually working with a slightly larger depth of field, even wide open on Micro Four Thirds bodies. That is actually an advantage when you are shooting in pubs and clubs. Generally, there's a lot of high contrast, the background tends to black out extremely well, and the slightly deeper depth of field that you get from a micro four thirds with wide open lenses actually gets more of the person you're shooting in focus than a full frame or an APS-C camera would. And I find that extremely advantageous. It's also easier on the autofocus systems as well, which does help from that point of view. You know, you are working with moving subjects in a low light environment. Anything that helps your autofocus system out is going to be a big plus point. So I find that what some people consider to be a limitation of the micro four thirds systems, actually find that a positive. So for me, aperture and that slightly increased depth of field that you get from micro four thirds over APS-C or full frame, for me is an advantage. And it's still shot wide open enough to give you background separation. Again, as you'll see in a number of these shots, you're not getting everything thrown out and blurred, but it's more than enough, in all honesty. So aperture is another one that I like. Coming on to point number 3, and that is the two lenses I'm using. So the image quality for these lenses, for the 20mm and 45mm, are extremely good. Both of these are well respected and renowned lenses in terms of their image quality, but they're also extremely affordable in the grand scheme of things. Now, if I could have a wish list, the 20mm f1.7 can be a little bit slow to focus. It's not ideal in that point of view. You know, I would want it to be a little bit quicker if I could, but it's not unusable. Not by any stretch of the imagination is it unusable. The 45mm Olympus, on the other hand, this thing is extremely quick to focus, very, very quiet in focusing, and both of them are absolutely tack sharp and perform extremely well wide open. So they're both good combinations in that regard, and they pair up extremely well for the work that I'm doing anyway. So I really like them from that perspective. And as I say, extremely cost effective. If memory serves me, if you wanted to, a GX7 with the 20mm f1.7, you could pick this pairing up probably, I think, for around about £300, which, again, to get you into photography for bands or just in general, it is actually a pretty good deal. It's not bad at all. And the lenses leads on to the fourth reason why I like these, and that is the image quality. Now, counter to that conventional wisdom that I mentioned earlier on, I personally think that the image quality is absolutely more than adequate from the perspective of what you need to do when it comes to shooting gigs, certainly at the scale that I'm doing it at. But let's be honest, most gig photography, most band photography, even the big concert stuff, is rarely used anywhere other than online. We are not talking images here that are going to be blown up to ridiculous sizes, that are going to be making wall-size prints off of the back of them. That simply isn't going to happen. So I don't really see the argument that the image quality and the pixel density isn't there in Micro Four Thirds for what you need, and even the 20 meg on the Olympus just isn't good enough for that. I've exhibited work that I've shot on these, and nobody, absolutely nobody, turned around and went, "Ooh, the image quality is not very good, is it?" And I've been asked to exhibit more of the work again later on this year, so I think the image quality is absolutely fine, and it is definitely there. Now, that's not to say that, you know, everything is rosy in the garden. Yes, I do need to use noise reduction, particularly on the images that are shot at much higher ISOs, and I probably need to use it a bit sooner than somebody that is shooting APS-C or full frame. But at the end of the day, it's not an egregious heavy. It's not a large amount of noise reduction that I'm having to throw in there, and it's certainly manageable. It's nothing that couldn't be done by the noise reduction within, let's say, Lightroom. It's new AI denoise. I personally use Topaz Photo AI for my denoising when I need to use it, and I'll be honest, I very rarely apply any noise reduction bar the base level that you get in there on the images that I convert over to black and white either, so that does also need to be taken into account. I think that the noise that you get out of these, particularly at moderate levels, is more than good enough. I actually quite like the noise that the Olympus gives me when converted over to black and white. I think it's not film noise grain quality, but it's doing a passable imitation of it, and I think it looks pretty good from that point of view. Now, there is one important caveat on that, and that is you need to do a couple of things to make sure that you're going to make the most out of these. So first of all, I always shoot in RAW. Absolutely always shoot in RAW, and nailing the exposure is actually really important when it comes to having a negative that is workable, because one of the things that you've got to take into account when you are editing, and we'll move on to that subject now, editing, one of the things that you've got to take into account when you're editing any band, gig, music, photography, and this applies whether you're shooting Micro Four Thirds or any other sensor format, or even film for that matter, that you're then scanning and editing, and that is that you are going to have extremes of both blacks and whites. You're going to have a lot of highlights in there, and you're going to have a lot of black and shadow details in there that you're going to have to deal with, and that's just a fact of life. You're looking at a lot of directional lighting going on here, a lot of quite hard directional lighting. You've got a lot of coloured filters and gels on those lights, or well, it's probably LED doing it these days, although I've been in a few venues where it is still gels on there, but you're going to have a lot of that, which is going to make the editing a trickier task, which is why most people tend to go for fairly high contrast work when it comes to editing up and shooting, editing the shots that they've taken of gigs and bands and things like that, and I tend to go down that route myself. I adopted a kind of aesthetic back in my film days 30 years ago, and I still to a large degree aim for that when I'm shooting on digital. So editing, and if people are interested, please do drop a message down in the comments below, because I'm quite happy to put a video together that looks into more detail at my editing workflow when it comes to shooting gigs. So if that is something people will be interested in, please do let me know in the comments down below. But yeah, that's kind of the main points as to why I use Micro Four Thirds for shooting gigs and things like that, and it is personal to me without a shadow of a doubt. But I think for a lot of people that are starting out and maybe thinking, you know, I can't really afford a full frame camera, the lenses are hideously expensive if I want to get fast primes or fast zooms, you know, and things like this, it is more than possible to do it. I'm doing it with what is, in all intents and purposes, quite an old body here, you know, and the first Micro Four Thirds camera I bought to shoot gigs with and shot for a while before I got the Olympus was this combination here, the Lumix GX7 and the 20mm f1.7. That did me for a few gigs before I then invested in the EM1 Mark II and the 45mm f1.8. So, you know, it is something that you can use and you can get into. So yeah, I just wanted to share my thoughts on why I personally use Micro Four Thirds for photographing gigs and concerts and things like that. Hopefully you found this video interesting. If you have, please do hit the like button, and if you want to see more content like this, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified when new videos get uploaded. Thanks very much for watching, everyone. Take care. Bye.